hesitation translated itself in two ways. Some people said the Security Council is not important enough. Why should we seek to enter it as a non-permanent? India is growing, we should come in as permanent. But these are two separate processes, and you have to work very, very hard at each one of them. With those comments on the elections yesterday, let me come to China. What are the facts that stare us in the face? One, India is a relatively new country. If you look at experiences in terms of a time horizon, we were subjected to 190 years of British colonial, you can call it rule, you can call it an experience. I'm not in a mood to use harsh language, especially on the record. But for those of you who have studied colonial experiences, know that the decision-making is not in the hands of the people. The decision-making takes place somewhere else. So we have put that 190 years of colonial experience behind us, and in the 63 years that we've been an independent country, I think we have demonstrated that our experience in nation building is second to none. We have developed a modern, secular polity, a thriving economy, which is today growing at, according to the IMF's estimates, at about 9.7%. It is going to grow. According to the background paper you have, it slowed down during the global financial and economic crisis, but that slowdown was also down to 6.5, 6.8%. What is the role of the population factor, which is what the ambassador was focusing on? And I will come to China. Well, in India's case, the population factor is not a disadvantage, it is an advantage. Let me explain to you. When we became an independent country, or rather we acquired independence in 1947, our population was 340 million or so. Today it is 1.156 billion. But the important point to note is that 64% of our population is in what I call the productive range. It is between the ages of 15 and 64. And the population which is below 15 and above 64 is declining. And I think the next few years, we will be adding next 20 years, we will be adding another 136 million to this productive range. Now, I was told this is 56% of our total population. Now, if you take 56% of 1 billion, that's 560 million, and you add to that another 55 million, that's about 600 million people that you have within the productive range of 15 and 64. And if you add another 136 million to that, or 135 million, it's going to be 735 million people who are productive. Now, that's saying a lot. China, similarly, is a very strong country in terms of economic clout. It has a population which is bigger than India's, but China at some stage chose consciously, as a matter of government policy, to follow the one-child family. And it worked very well up to a point, but I think if you're looking at what economists call the population dividend, I think China now realizes that it's good in many respects to curtail the growth of your population, but at some stage, someone else who has a young population can catch up. I am making no predictions. That's not part of my charter as a civil servant and as a diplomat. But I can say is that today India is able, because of a large number of factors. I'm only concentrating on population because my senior colleague referred to population. But population is something that has helped us, and I hope that we are able, along with sensible policies in other areas, to continue to take advantage of the population factor.
Yeah, 2 or 3 questions. Firstly, when you very modestly describe India as a new country, most of us who have studied some history remember that India goes back to, I mean, there are written texts,
yes,
texts in India of 2500 BC.
No, it goes even further. But
your DNA cannot be new.
No, I choose words very carefully. I said if you look at the current context, if you look at the current context, for 190 years we were a colony. If we are looking at India in terms of its historical, cultural, this thing, we are a 5,000-year-old civilization. On that, there's no doubt. But the fact is that 5,000-year-old civilization was subjected to economic. How strong language am I allowed to use? Pretty strong.
Yes.
It was economic exploitation. Now, if you look at the
that's not strong enough.
Well, I can get a little stronger as we go along. I'm happy. Let me give you one or two examples. Prior to the arrival of the East India Company, which set out as a trading company and then developed, pretensions and the edifice of an empire. During the days of the what is called the Mughal period in Indian history, there were people, Marwadis, traders in Calcutta, who had the economic ability to transfer the entire proceeds of the East India Company through one economic instrument and send it outside. So domestic capitalism was developed. Culturally, we were a very sophisticated, and as you will see I'm not talking only about India, but South Asia. I mean, those kinds of cultural excellence, that's still there in spite of all our problems. But we were not a polity in the sense of the modern nation state. That's what I meant. Yeah. The concept of the modern nation state, from my point of view, is an industrial, political entity. This really comes from, if you look at it, the Industrial Revolution in 1750 to 1850 in England, it comes in. So many of us have to overlook the humiliation that we feel because we were a far more advanced civilization. I don't see India, all our countries, than say Europe at a particular point of time, and you could get into a discussion. So when I say it's a new country in the modern context, I wish we had been allowed to, it's purely hypothetical, to take our own decisions during the previous 190 years of the so-called colonial experience. Colonialism resulted in some good things, I'm very clear. But it resulted in half-hearted measures. Railways, for instance, were introduced by the British colonial masters in order to serve as connections between the places where cotton was grown and the ports. So the cotton could be taken from there to the ports and sent to Manchester and Lancashire, and the ready products could come back. But the railways to develop the country, that had to start after 1947. That's the context.
Yes, but I'd like to come back to 2 points about the population. The diversity interests me because when you have such linguistic variety and such different ethnicities, the ability to make India nevertheless into a single country is remarkable. And you don't see this in other places. What is that secret which enabled India, despite the diversities in ethnicities, in linguistics, in food, you talked of railways. When you go from Delhi to Bombay, the railway train is crossing 7 different railway systems. That is diversity, and yet it is a single country. So there is something miraculous about India.
Ambassador, I would point in 2 areas. One is the sheer political maturity and wisdom of the post-independence leadership, in particular Jawaharlal Nehru, and democracy. These are the 2 areas where I find this thing. See, the fact that India has diversity is well established. It can be empirically delineated to you in terms of language, ethnicity, in terms of food, cultural traits. But that's not new. That's always existed. You had, for instance, empires in the south through the Cholas and others, which were completely different in terms of ethnicity, etc. And you had empires in the north. You had a country like Sri Lanka, which is in the south of India, which alternately traces its Indian links to either parts of Orissa or parts of Bengal. The Sinhalese say that they are not Dravidians, but they are Aryans like the others. Now, this debate has gone on. It's nothing new. But I think the fact that we developed a